When I first started out in electronics, I needed to know what you needed to get started. And so I got a cheap soldering iron, I learned a little bit, and came and go, and I've gained a lot of knowledge in the meantime. But something I found is kind of missing is there's lots of information on how to solder and lots of stuff available to help you, but there really isn't any good thing that explains exactly what all this is. So that's what I want to talk about today. There are three main kinds of soldering irons in the market today. They come in a variety of packages and designs, but they all really come down to these three. You have your basic soldering iron. This one's 25 watts. It plugs straight into the wall and gives you 25 watts of heat. Now if you want a little more control than that, you can get a rheostat controlled soldering iron. And this one's homemade. It simply has a light switch, a light dimmer, which is a rheostat. And this gives you a little more control about how much heat you have on your iron as you turn it on. If you turn it way down, it takes longer to heat up and controls the temperature a little bit, but it's not very accurate. Eventually, your soldering iron is going to get to the same temperature. In this case, this is 40 watts. So you get 40 watts worth of heat out of this soldering iron no matter what you do. It will just take longer to get there. Your third option is a temperature controlled soldering station. A soldering station actually measures the heat of the tip of the iron and just heats it up to the temperature you have set on the dial, which in this case, I have this one set to about 700 degrees. That's where I do most of my soldering at. So, depending on what you're doing, this soldering iron will do just about almost anything you need, but it's missing some features that this one has, and especially that this one has, and we'll discuss what those are today. Okay, so in front of me, I have three basic soldering irons. This is a 25 watt soldering iron, this one is 40 watts, and this one is 55. Now these will all work. They'll plug into the wall and they'll heat up, and you're able to use them to solder. The main difference between them is how hot they get. Now these are great. I used them for years and never had any real problems. You know, they tend to be a little bit front heavy. This one especially falls right on its front. These are a little better, but they tend to fall. I have a big hole burnt in my desk from this one. But I used one for years. I used a pair of pliers and I just put it on the cord and hold it upright. The second kind of soldering iron I want to talk about today is a rheostat controlled soldering station. Most of the cheap soldering stations you see are controlled by rheostats. They'll say things like watt control. If it doesn't say specifically that it is a temperature controlled soldering station, then it's probably controlled by a rheostat. And rheostats work very well for short-term use. The problem is, eventually, even though you only have this set to half power, it's going to heat up to the full potential. And since the whole point of the rheostat is to keep your iron a little bit cooler, then for short-term use, a rheostat's great, it works really well. But if you start using it more, then it becomes less effective the longer it's on. This is my Weller WES51. It costs about $100, but it comes with several things that those cheaper soldering irons we talked about today just don't have. The first thing it has is balance. When you pick this up and hold it in your hand, it feels natural. That's because the balancing point on it is right about there. And if you see, when you hold it in your hand, you hold it just like a pencil, and that naturally balances right on your wrist. So it's very easy to hold. The second thing you notice when you pick it up is how thin the grip is, which is great when you're trying to solder a lot because holding a big bulky thing gets uncomfortable. It also has a lot of thermal capacity but a very narrow tip. And these are things that are hard to find in cheaper soldering irons. It has a cord that's very flexible, so you don't end up with all the problems, so you don't have to drag it across your bench and spend a lot of time like you would with a cheap one moving it around. It's very easy to move. They come with nice stands that have sponges in them for keeping your soldering iron clean. And you can buy one of these from anywhere from about $50 on up. What you're really looking for is any soldering iron that says temperature controlled. That means that it has a sensor inside the tip that sends back the information to the unit and turns on and off the power to keep it at the temperature you set it at. In this case, it's set at 700 degrees. That's about where I keep it for most of my soldering tasks. Some other features of this iron that you probably won't find in cheaper irons is the tip is grounded. so you don't have to worry about building up an electric charge on it and staticking your components and killing them. So now that we've talked about all the different kinds of soldering irons on the market, I wanted to give you my final recommendation. What would I suggest you as a beginning electronics person buys? And I would have to say my recommendation would be to buy a small pencil iron like this. This one's 25 watts. I'd say probably go 40. A 40-watt soldering iron is a good general purpose soldering iron that will do just about any task you ask it to. I would not recommend getting a rheostat soldering station. I think they're more hassle than they're worth. Yeah, they give you a little bit more control over power, but it's not reliable. Sometimes they'll be hotter than other times, and it just doesn't seem to work as well for me as just knowing exactly what I'm getting, like I do with either of these choices. So I wouldn't recommend a rheostat station. And especially with the price of soldering iron stations today, I can get a nice temperature controlled soldering station from China for about $40 at the bottom of the range, and that's really good money for your valuable work. It might last for years, it might not, but for about $100 if you can spring for it, a nice baseline welder station like this should last you for years. But you'll still want one of these. So I'd get one of these until you know exactly what you want to do with it.